This is looking right in the teeth of a gale, and that gale could lead us to a recession.
It's coming. And it's not if, but when. The end of Australia's property boom time.
Party's over.
It's definitely over, and it's going to be over for quite some time.
Tonight, experts across the industry, the market analyst, the estate agent, the investor, the data scientist and the liquidator deliver their sobering verdicts.
Get out while you can.
Get out while you can, absolutely.
At the worst end of the spectrum, if everything turned against us, we could see property prices 40 to 45% down from their peaks, which is a huge deal.
Who loses out big in the next couple of years?
Everyone.
Home ownership is our national obsession, but are we finally waking up from the great Australian dream? Streets and suburbs across Australia, families are losing the mortgage battle.
I don't think I'm the only one who's struggling. I don't think I'm the only one. There's a lot of people out there struggling. I mean, this minute I'm talking to you, not knowing if I'll be here for the next 6 months or not.
For as long as most of us care to remember, or perhaps only as long as we want to remember, property prices in Australia have only gone in one direction, at least in our big cities. Now, not only do we have the most inflated housing prices on the planet, but our property frenzy has generated statistics that stagger the rest of the world. Our personal mortgage debt is stratospheric, actually at levels America reached just before the GFC. And worse still, Australia's economy is more dependent on housing than any other on earth.
In dollars held by the banks in mortgages for owner-occupiers and investors. And that's about 65% of their total lending. That's higher than any other country in the Western world by a long way.
Data scientist Martin North of Digital Finance Analytics says the problem is blindingly obvious. Australia is addicted to debt.
There's probably no country in the world more susceptible to the ramifications of a housing crash than Australia.
We are uniquely exposed at the moment because as a society and as a government and as a regulatory system, we're all banking on the home price engine. Just goes on giving and giving and giving, right? But it's not going to. Australia now, and where the US was in 2006 and 2007. We've got a debt bomb, we've got a debt crisis, and at some point it's going to explode in our face. People sitting on big loans with no ability to be able to service them.
Increasing mortgage distress means a new word is now stalking our suburbs: foreclosure.
It's where the developers are desperate for buyers.
Desperate for buyers at the moment.
Major real estate companies refused our requests to interview their agents on the housing front line.
Your town?
But brave agent Peter Unan is defying his industry colleagues to speak the truth. Peter has seen foreclosures rise 600% in his area, and other agents we spoke to off camera confirmed that number.
The mortgage stress is definitely being felt, especially in this area. People are coming and asking to put their property maybe back on the market because it might have been on the market for 4 to 6 weeks and it's struggling to sell.
Our big mistake? Believing that house prices would keep going up and up forever.
Were we all in fantasy land there for a while?
The market was clearly overvalued. There's no doubt about that.
I've got the view that there were so many people all on the same drug, right? The banks, the Reserve Bank, and individuals, and everyone was expecting and hoping that prices would always go up. Individuals and households that are actually right up against it. And therefore, my prediction is that over the next 12 months or so, yes, defaults are going to rise. We've got about 52,000 households we think that will default over the next year.
There are now nearly 1 million Australian homeowners suffering from serious mortgage stress who, despite cutting back wherever they can, simply don't have the income to keep up with their loan repayments. But those already doing it hard are about to do it a whole lot harder, thanks in part to the banks who lent them their mortgages in the first place. The last couple of weeks have brought 2 grim and ominous headlines.
Bank data shows that nearly a half of all homeowners trying to refinance their mortgages are being knocked back. Compare that to only 5% a year ago. Scientist Martin North.
A lot of people bought in relatively recently with massively large mortgages, highly leveraged. The banks were way too loose in their lending standards. So we have a lot of people with not much wriggle room now. You can't refinance because nobody will refinance you. You can't sell the property because there's not enough equity. I mean, that's a nightmare scenario, but it's not completely unrealistic.
So you think it's very clear that so many of the people that we see on the brink now have almost been set up to fail by the bank?
There is no doubt that they've got loans they should never have got.
Some people can afford to sit, others can't. The ones that can't afford to sit should effectively sell.
Get out while you can?
Get out while you can, absolutely. Get out while you can.
Jamison Lautet is a leading liquidator, the last port of call when owners default or banks call in their mortgages. It's a good business in bad times.
Mortgagee sales have certainly increased, and I think it's reflective of the banks realising that property prices are going to deteriorate.
But you think if the banks can do the mortgages over and cover their own backside, they're happy to do so?
I think the banks are going to cover their own arse. And I think that realistically, if they foresee that they can get their money back before everyone else, then they will do so.
A reality check is coming.
I think the reality check is coming. I think it's not too far away. The question is, how big is the cliff?
First off the cliff will be homeowners and investors with interest-only loans. 70-year-old John Norris was about to retire on the rent from a small portfolio of investment properties in Adelaide. He'd bought them with interest-only loans, which he'd been paying faithfully. Then he got a letter from his bank.
So that's it. That's the notice that no more interest only.
That's right.
The bank suddenly switched his loans to interest and principal.
Now, how much does that mean your repayments go up each month once you get that notification?
Well, that increased by 57%.
Your monthly repayments?
Monthly repayments.
The bank's shown much compassion in the way they've dealt with you?
No, they haven't shown any compassion whatsoever.
John is a casualty of banks calling in the interest-only loans that they so freely offered until recently. His mate, property investor Bushy Martin, is mad as hell.
You've seen John, you've seen his wife. What's it done to them?
Devastating, Tom. Absolutely devastating. And they feel helpless in relation to being able to do anything because no one's listening.
There'd be thousands upon thousands of people across Australia in the exact same boat as John right now. Retirees who thought they were just about there and now whack. Completely different game.
Absolutely. So for no fault of their own coming up to the finish line, they've been very severely penalised, and it's having some major anxiety and stress impacts and financial impacts on people's lives at a point when they should be really enjoying it.
It's just one more dirty secret from the banks. Market analyst Louis Christopher.
Why do you think the banks are so secretive about how they deal with these foreclosures?
Well, I think they're trying to stop anger, resentment towards them, potentially stop any type of panic that's out there. But at the same time, I think as a community, we are owed at least a little bit more transparency in terms of what is going on.
The fact is that the banks know that we're on the edge of a potential precipice. On pretty much every metric that you can think about, we have way more debt than we should, and we're sleepwalking into a crisis next year, in my view.
Well, does this prove that there is a banking cartel at work in Australia when we see the banks pushing up prices in unison?
Carrington, I'm appalled that you use the word cartel. The politically correct word is oligopoly, and it's hard not to conclude that is the case. But the bigger implication is I would have thought that during the Royal Commission it would be a brave bank that would increase its housing pricing, and that has now proved to be 100% correct as we see the oligopoly basically perhaps exceeding common sense. And this really does create a bit of an issue politically in Australia.
The government has claimed that that would take a baseball bat to property prices. Do you agree?
I think there's a real risk that it would. But I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing either. At some point, high house prices feel good to an old bloke like me, but they're not very good for my children. So perhaps it's bad for their inheritance. But the Labor proposals, as I understand them at this point, and it's not 100% clear, But what they're talking about doing is removing the negative gearing and 50% concessional capital gains tax discount on existing housing. Now they'll grandfather everything else, but the best way to think of it is this, is I buy a house or an apartment off the plan, it's a new property, I can negatively gear it, I get the capital gains tax discount. I sell that property to you, 3 or 4 years later it becomes an existing property, you can't negatively gear it and you don't get the capital gains tax discount. Will you pay as much for it as I paid? Now at the moment, the excess of basically my franking credits over my tax bill, I get that back in the hand as basically a cash refund. They're going to carve pensioners out from this under the proposal as I understand it. But what we're talking about is basically removing that. Now I think that diminishes the appeal of basically franking credits for a lot of investors. And when you have a look at the excess source of franking credits in the Australian market or the excess source of dividend yields, it's all banking stocks. So these things are actually probably quite negative for banks. But there is one more thing to think about, and this is probably the most significant one, which is that with the banks now having repriced up housing, that's a de facto interest rate tightening that now ripples through the economy. Now, if NAB follow, it's about 1.5 billion, it's about 0.5% of retail sales.
You say that taking a baseball bat to the property market might not be a bad thing, especially for those people who maybe are trying to get into the property market, but how bad do you think the damage could be?
Well, you can always change it, and you know, if house prices really fall, you can always cut, the Reserve Bank could always cut interest rates.